We don't know is, why did the EU agree to this trade deal? Joining me now to discuss is Daniel Crowell, lead economist at Oxford Economics. Thank you so much for your time. So Daniel, it seems like the EU have kind of made a calculation here, pulling back from that $100 billion retaliatory tariffs they were preparing in favour of the predictability and stability of 15%. The question is it worth it?
Well, look, some people will argue it's a good deal. The EU avoided worse. We have the same tariff as Japan, lower than China and some East Asian economies. On the other hand, some people complain that or are embarrassed that the EU essentially capitulated without asking anything in return on the trade front. I think the bigger picture here is very important. The fact that this takes place in the context of sort of EU dependence on the US, not just for trade, energy, tech, but also security and defense. Continued reliance on support for Ukraine, continued alignment on Russia sanctions. So as you have seen today, a day after this framework deal was announced, President Trump announced that shortened the deadline for Russia to reach a ceasefire in Russia, in Ukraine. Is this a coincidence? Maybe one of your reporters will find out whether these two were linked. But essentially, it reflects the reality of a much more transactional U.S. administration with no love lost for the EU, and the reality of the EU's dependence on the US that goes much beyond trade and energy and tech, but also to security and defense.
It's a good question, I think, about this all being tied together. Trump's sort of hardening stance on Russia, his softening perhaps on Gaza, and this all coming at the same time as this EU trade deal. When we look at the European stocks today, I mean, stocks have been up. Some are seeing that as a sign this deal isn't necessarily so bad because there have been significant carve-outs for some goods in this deal, Daniel.
Well, I think there is some uncertainty premium that's being removed. I think markets perceive this as the floor of a deal, and that's something that can be built on and improved. I think some of the winners in the EU include the automakers, which have got the same, whose tariff went down from 25 to 15, the same as in Japan, and much lower than the rest of the world, which is still at 25. So you'll have pockets of sort of relative winners, even though overall, in absolute terms, of course, new tariffs mean new trade barriers for EU exporters, and so it will be harder to export from the EU to the US.
How likely is it that the EU agreed to this deal knowing that it could never work in practice because it would take a long time to implement, especially elements such as the deal, the $750 billion energy deal?
Well, I think the European officials have worked out that President Trump is a fan of big numbers and big announcements. So that's why we have this commitment to buy a lot more U.S. energy and U.S. defense equipment, even though the EU itself has no power to enforce that. This is a framework deal between the president of the EU Commission and the U.S. president, even though the EU Commission has no competence over this. This is a matter for national governments. So I think it's also that this can materialize really in the long grass. You know, we're talking years down the line when new realities will occur and new deals, new wins will come along. So it's really just to grab the headlines with big numbers, and probably should take these numbers with a pinch of salt, and also the commitment from both sides and sort of some complete absence of realistic plans to achieve them.
And I guess added to that, we're already seeing some cracks emerge among European leaders. We know this deal is going to have to be signed off by all 27 members, all of whom have differing interests and reliance on the export of goods. So, I mean, how likely is there to be a consensus here?
Well, it's always difficult for the EU to achieve a consensus. Also, the situation is very different. If you recall the Brexit negotiations with the UK, that's when really the EU member states stuck together and stuck to a common stance. Now the situation is more complex. We're dealing with a much bigger sort of counterparty. There's a lot more at stake given our dependence on security and defense on the US. So we'll have member states have different interests, but again, the pain threshold and the risk tolerance among even the countries that don't feel so threatened by Russia and the need for a U.S. security umbrella, I think the risk tolerance is quite low there to risk an escalatory dynamic like we've seen with China, between U.S. and China, now that this framework deal has been agreed. So overall, I think there'll be some sort of complaints publicly and sort of embarrassments, but I think eventually they'll fall into line because of what is the alternative really.
Yeah. Daniel Crowell, it's great to have your thoughts at this hour. Thank you very much for joining us.